Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning to discuss this research project on the quality of work. My name is Marilyn Hart, and I'm from the Secretariat of the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency. As many of you may well know, the agency is essentially a board, an independent board that advises the Commonwealth Government on skills and workforce development in Australia. This piece of research was commissioned by our board as part of its broader ongoing research agenda, and the board was particularly interested in understanding more about the factors affecting quality of work because it's relevant to both employees and employers. Due to the implications for employee well-being, flexible work practices, job design, recruitment and turnover, as well as employee and firm productivity. Just in terms of the process of obtaining the research, we ran a competitive tender and the project was awarded to a team from Curtin University. The team comprised Professors Julia Connell, who's with us today, Professor John Burgess, and Associate Professor Mike Dockery. We did also have a reference group that we established to provide feedback and guidance on the project. The reference group was chaired by one of our board members, Dr. John Edwards, and we were also very grateful to have the input from the Australian Human Resources Institute, from Lynn Goodyear, and from the National Employment Services Association, represented by Sally Sinclair. ACCI, Jenny Lambert represented ACCI. She's the Director of Education, Employment and Training. And we also had Andrew Detmer, who is the AMWU National President. And certainly their feedback along the way was very, very useful. So the team's report is now complete and published on our website, so I'd certainly encourage you to take a close look at it if you haven't already and to refer colleagues to that report. And the objective today is to provide an opportunity to hear a bit more about the report from one of the lead researchers in the team, Professor Connell. So at this stage, I'd like to hand over to her to lead us through a discussion of the key findings of the report, and then we'll provide some time for questions at the end. So can I now hand over to Julia and ask Professor Connell to take us through some of the key findings of the report.
Thank you, Marilyn, and good morning from me. Thank you for signing up for this webinar today, especially when it's such a busy time of year. I'd like to say on behalf of the team, which has been mentioned already, Professor John Burgess and Mike Dockery, and also our research assistants, that we thank you to all for assigning this report to us, or this project. It was fairly tight timelines because we started in March and finished in October and undertook a very large literature review and also 9 case studies across Australia. So given that the report itself is over 100 pages long, and I've been given approximately 30 minutes this morning, I'm really just going to highlight some of the key points from our findings. So the purpose of the report itself, and these were guidelines that were set by AWPA, as you can see, were to actually see if we could determine strategies to improve job quality, find out if there are any links between job quality itself, job satisfaction, innovation and productivity, understand whether there may be any Australia-specific factors that were relevant, and determine whether we could come up with a set of indicators for the quality of work in Australia. And for the presentation this morning, I'm just going to give some of the key findings from the literature review. This is pretty much set out as we set out the report, and then provide the case study evidence and some conclusions and implications. So fairly evident from the job quality literature is that the topic itself is both objective and subjective. And we find that most reports are actually self-reported data, meaning that we've got employees and workers actually giving the feedback themselves. So therefore, we've already got a set of subjective criteria. Some that tend to be objective are related to pay, that's set, and also working hours. But if we ask about issues such as job satisfaction, then obviously there's areas that come in that are related to subjectivity. We found in the literature that many researchers had actually undertaken areas where they were reporting on clusters of job categories. And these tended to fall into categories such as whether they were insecure jobs, whether they were team-based jobs, whether workers were passive in their work, whether they were high strain or high workload, and what did this actually mean for job health or worker health, and in terms of output and issues such as absenteeism and turnover, etc. One of the first things we had to do was define job quality. And what we came up with is the extent to which a set of job attributes contributes to or detracts from workers' well-being in their work or non-work domains. What we found is, of course, the concept is multidimensional. So it's difficult to say that it would be definitely this set of criteria or that set of criteria according to, maybe it was a sector or a particular job that someone was doing. So this is from obviously the employee perspective. So it's not intended, as it says here, to diminish the importance of non-employee perspectives or either to look at the result from the employer or the unemployed, and we wanted to include that also. But what we did find overall is that a good work environment and good earnings were expected by our sample group, but factors such as supervision quality, work-life balance, and recognition we found actually had much more impact on the perception of job quality in the workplace. There were a number of limitations in the literature itself, and a lot of this is to do with the fact that there's not been any uniform analysis undertaken, so it's difficult to actually compare results across different studies and also across different countries, jurisdictions, and so on. But we did find that there tended to be agreement on some factors that were actually affecting well-being in the workplace. And some determinants of a good job, we've included quite a lot of information on this in the full report, but for example, we found that work that is not characterized by monotony and repetition, where employees have a level of autonomy and control, where there's some kind of balance between efforts and rewards, where workplace relationships are good, where there's opportunities for career and promotion opportunities, and as an attempts to engage employees in the workplace. This is just some of the factors that came out from a number of different research projects that we included in our literature review. One of the things we were asked to look at was evidence between job quality and productivity, and to find out whether there were potentially any association. What we did find is that the literature is inconclusive itself, because we can consider productivity at various levels. At the macro level, for example, do improvements in average job quality result in higher per capita productivity? Or also at the workplace level, the micro level, does improvement in the quality of job enhance productivity? So we found that technology, for example, may have increased productivity, but it may have actually reduced job quality. So one example would be in some call centres, not all of them, where work is enabled through technology, but it means that engagement, for example, in some places, or sort of the intensity of work has actually increased, so it has reduced job quality overall. However, as evident from the literature and one of the citations we've given here, dissatisfied workers can actually impose large costs on firms. This could be through counterproductive behaviour, through less commitment, absenteeism, high turnover, and so on. So we found that the positive impact of job quality on productivity, sometimes framed, as we've said here, as a happy, productive worker hypothesis, can obviously result in the opposite outcome, so more commitment, less turnover, and less absenteeism. What was interesting also from the literature is that indicated that higher job quality was also found to result in fewer occupational injuries in the workplace. So moving on to job satisfaction and worker performance, many of people who would research on this topic would know over time that people have been very interested to find out which relates to which, whether people perform well because they're satisfied, or if they're satisfied, they perform well. And research has found positive associations between the two. And there's some broad agreement in the literature, for example, what's referred to as high-performance work systems, where bundles, for example, of high human resource initiatives are put into place in the workplace, and they're founded on employee involvement and empowerment, can actually have a positive result. However, the research is still not sufficiently advanced to establish causality between job quality and productivity and satisfaction. What we found in some countries, in the US particularly, there has been quite a bit of research where they've been looking at what constitutes a good job or a bad job, and much of this is related to engagement and participation at work, skill use development, autonomy, flexibility, and social relations. When we looked at international comparisons, compared with Australia, we found there tend to be cycles in the way that job outcomes and job quality is actually panning out. On average, it found that job quality can be expected to be poorer in times of higher unemployment, of course, and most countries this was evident after the GFC. The recent report from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the World of Work, found that job quality had declined after the GFC, and youth and long-term unemployment had risen. And as indicated here, we also found the incidence of involuntary temporary and part-time work had increased in 80% of countries that are analysed in that report. The European Working Conditions Survey, this has been undertaken since 1990. It's carried out every 5 years, and it's covered the latest survey, 44,000 workers across 34 countries. And a number of indices, 4 in fact, are actually covered here with earnings, job prospects, intrinsic job quality, and working time quality. And what they'd found in the latest survey, which is 2012, that there was very little difference in findings across industrial structures. They found that job quality was lower in the Eastern European countries and higher in the Nordic countries, which may not be surprising. And they also categorized as some of the other research I mentioned earlier into what they referred to as high-paid good jobs, and 14% fell into this category. 37% fell into well-balanced good jobs. 29% were found to be in poorly balanced jobs, 20% in poor quality jobs. So roughly half of the respondents, 44,000, were found to be in poor quality jobs and roughly half in good quality jobs. They also found overall that the survey showed improvement in working time quality, so meaning that workplaces were better at meeting employee needs for good work-life balance. So several approaches to measuring job quality that can be undertaken. There's obviously statistical indicators and national surveys, analysis of national labour force and social statistics, and Australia has a number of key legislative and policy measures in place that address job quality, as we mentioned here, such as Fair Work Australia. This is not necessarily the case in some other countries, and we look, as I mentioned before, about in the US. And increasingly, the studies from the US have showed that there's segmentation occurring into good jobs and bad jobs. And the recent calculation of report and research there shows that 24% of US workers were found to be in bad or dead-end jobs. And this was related to their pay, conditions, benefits, and security. So before we started the case studies, we also found from the literature that there appear to be what we categorised as 8 influences on job quality in Australia, which we've listed here. I won't go through them all, but just referring to a couple. For the ageing workforce, for example, something that's well known. But what needs to be considered in relation to job quality is if we're going to need older workers to stay in work, then how is job quality perceived by those older workers? It's important for retention issues, and also for work-life balance and well-being, to ensure that some of those workers can actually who want to stay in the workforce. Another point here about immigration as a response to skill shortages. This was related to people who are brought into work in Australia largely due to their skills, being able to use their skills to the full extent in the workplace. And when we summarise, I'll be looking at how those 8 influences panned out in the case studies themselves. So job quality in Australia, we found, does compare favourably by international standards. At the time of undertaking the literature review, which was earlier this year, we found there's a relatively strong labour market, and the legal safeguards that are in place support workers in the workplace in many cases. However, we said there is a strong case for ongoing monitoring of job quality overall. and for monitoring the identified subgroups of employees who may be vulnerable to labour market changes. In terms of research so far, Australia has invested far less than the EU in terms of coordinated efforts to measure and monitor job quality. There's some notable studies which we've actually listed in our report, and a couple of these would relate to what's referred to as the HILDA studies, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics studies, and this is carried out every year. And the latest one included 13,000 people from 7,500 households. And this is very useful in terms of a measure to show how Australians are feeling about work. And it shows on average that most are satisfied with their jobs. However, another study that we included, which was the Australian Work-Life Index, which has been carried out twice so far, did show that many workers were very dissatisfied with their work-life balance. So one of the aims of undertaking the literature review was to come up with some kind of framework that we could actually use when we went to undertake the case study research. So we decided, having analysed many of the other surveys, that we would use or base this on the Eurofound studies, the European Working Conditions Survey, as it had been undertaken extensively and covered many of the factors that were showing to be important in other studies. We did, however, change the dimensions, and this we extended to include another dimension which we referred to as extrinsic job quality. So you can see it's broken into 4 different dimensions: job prospects, these factors like the physical environment and the extrinsic job quality, dimension 3, which is the intrinsic job quality, and dimension 4, working time quality. So we undertook we went through, obviously, through ethics clearance through the university, set up templates and forms of analysis and questionnaires for various factors in the workplace, such as the managers, non-managers, union representatives, human resource managers, and other relevant personnel. For the case studies, we included 9 case studies, and we gave them identifiers, as you can see, which fairly well explain what the sector that they were in. And you can see there's a range in the number of employees from 12,000 down to the small business. We were asked to include every size of business if we could. We've got private and public sector here included. And you can see resources, mining, construction companies, manufacturing, local government, TAFE, aged care, an energy company, and a consulting firm. So quite a good range going across different areas of Australia: Western Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland. In terms of the sample size themselves, we had 69 participants, so people that were interviewed, 42 interviews and 9 focus groups. Of the sample, 90% were permanent full-time, and they were predominantly male, 60% male, and the remained female, 40%, and 52% were non-managers, and 48% were managers. So our findings, when we were relating this to the framework, just going through the dimensions 1 and 2 to start with, I'll just go through some of the key points here. We found that the influence on job satisfaction and innovation and productivity, that recognition can drive innovation. We found examples of one organisation which had a strategy where they said that employees did not need to go to the senior manager if they wanted to innovate. Small innovations they could just go ahead and do it, and it was actually referred to as the Just Do It program, and this was proving to have very good feedback from employees. We also found that in several companies, 3 of the case studies in fact, that employees were clearly aware that they could get much better pay elsewhere, but their working environment and the prospects of the job and the challenges in the workplace, which they felt they were being developed to actually meet, kept them in the job rather than going to another organisation where they could have got more money. This PowerPoint is fairly busy, so I'll just pick out some of the key points here. one of the outstanding points that came across in most of the case studies was that leadership and management was extremely important and had a very large impact on virtually everything else that happened in the organization. In terms of direct supervision, who is the direct supervisor and how do they interact with the employees? It was also identified as one of the key levers for employee engagement and whether people stayed in their job in some cases or not. Another interesting factor from the intrinsic job quality was what was referred to by one organization as not work-life balance, but work-life fit. And this, they pointed out, was because not every employee would want necessarily to do have flexible hours. Certain times in their work life cycle, they may want to do more hours. At other points, they might want to do less if they've got caring responsibilities, for example. So they found it's important to refer to that as fit for the individuals, which they could work around, as opposed to balance and trying to have a one-size-fits-all kind of measure in place. Dimension 4, working time quality. This was particularly interesting when it came to the fly-in, fly-out FIFO workers. We had two organizations that had almost 50% of their workforce were FIFO, and one that had the 9-day fortnight in place. And the 9-day fortnight was seen as a very strong retention tool, and the organizations using FIFO workers had worked very hard to provide what they called family-friendly rosters and also put into place a number of healthcare schemes which were sure to actually cover employees not just when they're at work but also outside of work, so healthcare checks, support on and off the job to ensure that they had more holistic care overall. And this was having an impact. And what was interesting is some of the participants told us that they had had people coming into work as FIFO workers as they found it less stressful than other jobs they'd had before, such as teaching. So what did we find that were job quality benefits to the organization? Well, overall, we found that there was certainly an issue there about attracting and also retaining employees. The organization on the 9-day fortnight said that it was a very strong attraction tool for bringing people into the workplace, but also, as I mentioned, several of the organizations were aware that other companies were paying better, but they were able to retain their employees because of the whole package and the positive workplace culture. There was also organizations being able to improve employee engagement and the passion for the job. There seemed to be a spillover effect. So certainly this, again, goes back to the leadership and management as well. And meeting core organizational goals, and creating a more pleasant and supportive work environment overall. At the firm level, I've already mentioned about direct supervision, and it's a critical factor relating to job quality. So it's recommended that in some cases we found that it weren't always employees and employers' expectations in terms of career paths were not necessarily always aligned, that there was definitely a need to have some more succession planning in place. And what are referred to in some cases as quick promotions were occurring, where there was a need to have a supervisor or someone at the next level was not necessarily ready to step up and had not been put into that particular talent pipeline. There's also was an encouraged open communication and contribution of ideas, and this was evident again in the FIFO workplaces where it was important that supervisors were actually able to go out on site and communicate directly with their employees, and they were able to actually support that with someone undertaking some of the administration to free them up to actually be able to do it. So it's recommended that workplace systems be identified where flexibility might be offered. And nurturing ownership and autonomy, as I mentioned before, about the local government and the Just Do It program, which was quite evident about getting positive results for employees. So returning to the 8 Australia-specific factors that we found from the literature seem to be influencing the quality of work. I mentioned that we'd come back to this. So the ageing workforce, to start with, what was interesting, again, in the case of the FIFO workers, that one of the companies was offering part-time fly-in, fly-out contracts as a retention strategy to keep some of those workers in place. And I mentioned before about the 9-day fortnight also being equal to that. Now, the ageing workforce is interesting because one of our case studies was an aged care facility. And this is where we found that there was dissatisfaction with pay by the aged carers themselves. And some of those people were actually aging. And given that we've got an aging workforce, then it's possible, I mean, we do need to address the pay issue and the dissatisfaction to keep those people in the workforce that are doing that particular job and are going to be more needed as time goes on. We found with the feminisation of the workforce, particularly in some of the predominantly male workplaces, that some of them were making very big efforts to not only recruit more females, but provide more development and promotion opportunities for them. We found with the trying to reconcile work and non-family demands, I mentioned already about the family-friendly rosters. There was another workplace that also were allowing employees or putting into place support with carers, so they actually were able to book online to get a carer to come and help if they needed at short notice, someone to look after a child or maybe an elderly relative, and that was seen as something that was important in terms of support. Having meaningful work for all. I mentioned about two of the companies actually have been awarded for their strategies to employ large numbers of Indigenous workers and recruit, train and retain them once they'd actually recruited them. And we found that where non-standard employment contracts were concerned, that this was already happening, the tightening of the labour market in Resource Co and Mining Co. And, for example, they'd said that they'd had 300 people on casual contracts, and this had reduced to 12 in the past year. And just keeping people in the permanent workforce and reducing the casual workers. So, Australia-specific factors influencing the quality of work itself. We found that there was, again, a couple of the last two of the 8 factors, ongoing structural adjustment, that there were certain challenges associated with TAFE, for example. They're having funding changes, and this was impacting on employees in the TAFE sector, and certainly on their perceptions of job security and career opportunities in the future. And they had reported increased work intensity and having to take on more administrative work with fewer workers. Also, in the company that we called Energy Co, they had foreign ownership, and they were finding that they felt that the distance involved and the perhaps lack of communication that was happening from the owners was also instilling in them a sense of job insecurity, because in the sector itself there was uncertainty, and this was impacting on the workers. The point about accommodating and the use of migrant labour, one of the companies, in fact one of the small organisations, Construction Services Co, as we called it, had employed 15 457 visa holders, and was obviously very pleased with the work they'd undertaken, because they converted them to full-time permanent employees. We also found out that where applicable, they had also employed their wives, and they had come on board in the organisation too. So in summarising the job quality indicators and measures, we found that the framework we used, in fact, did serve to identify the range of issues that were relevant to each of the case study organisations, and they were able to relate to this to all the workers and the employers. We found that in place in the organisations there were no systematic or operational job quality frameworks. We found that most of the measures that were put into place by organisations tended to be reactive as opposed to proactive, although some were strategic and they were linked to issues such as recruitment and retention and commitment. And for the 4 criteria that I mentioned in the beginning that we set out to address, we found that the template or the framework that was created does afford the opportunity for organizations to check and see, are we actually meeting the dimensions and factors here, in what ways? And some of the case studies, I've mentioned here about caveats in place. Because there were only 9 and 69 employees, it cannot be as broad or as deep as ongoing studies such as those that are being undertaken in Europe in particular. But we think we did manage to identify what was quite some useful issues and some exemplary case studies here within specific workplaces that we think could potentially be replicated elsewhere. That's my 30 minutes. So questions
Excellent.
and comments.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Connell, for that very useful overview. Staying to time in an amazing way, given the amount of material that you've managed to cover. Now, we certainly have allowed time for questions, and we would very much encourage people to send them through. Just key them in and keep them coming. As I mentioned, we've already got some that have been lodged, and we'll go through as many as we can in the time we have available now. I'd like to begin with a question, if I may, please, Professor Connell, and just to ask, in the research, were there any findings that surprised you? Anything unexpected that popped up?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things. We were actually pleasantly surprised to find the extent to which employees were committed to their work and particularly to their clients. And overall, we did find it was a positive picture of job satisfaction and job commitment. And I think I was fairly surprised personally about the comment that some of the people had joined the FIFO workforce because they found it less stressful than teaching, for example, and the amount of attention that was being paid to the well-being of those workers in their case studies.
Yeah. So some pluses for employers.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
and the workers too.
Yeah. That's a good thing to find. Just turning to some of the questions that are coming through, and we do have several, so we'll have to probably be as selective and quick as we can. But one of the questions that asked was, in your research, did you find managers and employees in the same organisation had similar perceptions of job quality? Were they pretty well lined up?
It really depended on the organisation. I think that certainly there were comments in some of the FIFO workplace that there was different attitudes to work. And we found we did interview some of the FIFO workers themselves as well as the managers. And some of them had said that prior to some of the initiatives in place that they found that they were getting stressed just even thinking about going back to work. So there were some issues that really affected them prior to some of the changes in the health concerns that were being put into place there. So yes, I think and again, we've obviously got a professional organisation, the consulting company. Then people were very highly qualified there. They were being autonomous. They were empowered. So there wasn't a lot of difference in those kind of workplaces. Yes, in the aged care and the public sector organisation, there were differences. Particularly, you're finding where people don't have a managerial position, there's probably more stress. They don't know what's going on. And also in Energy Co, so they're not being communicated with about the changes that possibly could be afoot. So because of that uncertainty, it's creating some sense of job insecurity. And I think that's sort of very topical into what's happening this week with Holden, some of the car companies. Yeah,
indeed.
But I mean, that pretty much they know what's going on. But there's a suspicion in some of the other companies that they might lose their jobs. Yeah.
Indeed. Okay, thank you for that. We've also got someone who's asked, if you'd like to comment on the fact that, Australia seems to be a bit different in its approach and style compared to other countries, even in terms of the, perhaps lack of emphasis on measurement of job quality compared to overseas. But yet we seem to come out quite well. Would you like to just comment on where Australia sits? I think this person's asking in terms of the international stage.
Yes, well, I think a lot of it depends on funding. There's obviously been a huge amount of funding put into the European studies that have been going on. They're very extensive and been taking place for some time. So there was a need for a comprehensive job quality improvement program in the EU, and it is providing systematic evidence across Europe, and particularly given the number of participants in the study. In the US, the Economic Policy Institute that's been undertaking some of that work is privately funded, and it's interested in the benefits of growth and recession, how it's shared across the economy. So they tend to analyse official data. Some of the studies that are in our report, such as I mentioned two already about the Hilda study, the Awali study, Australian Work-Life Index. We've also got the Australian Workplace and Industrial Relations Survey, the Australian Quality of Work Survey, the ACTU work on secure jobs. These are usually funded through, obviously ACTU has funded their own work there, and they may not necessarily be ongoing longitudinal studies. The Hilda study is, so we're not getting that systematic kind of analysis. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics have also recognised that even with the household income and labour dynamics, there needs to also be something that's correlated with the workplace. So it isn't actually occurring at the moment, so it hasn't been as in-depth or ongoing. But this, is a start, and it may be that there's a recognition that it can continue.
Yeah, well, this might kickstart some more work in the area. And certainly I'm aware that there are other people in the academic area who are interested in this field of work too.
Do you want me to just pick some? Okay. All right. There's quite a few questions coming in, so we'll just try to repeat those and see if we can just answer some of those in the time that we've got available. One of the questions was that research in job quality seems to mirror a lot of research about high-performing teams, and I mentioned about high-performing workplaces, and yes, this is true. It does, and the high-performing teams, high-performing workplaces literature indicates about the bundles, I mentioned this previously, of human resource practices that may be introduced, and certainly they're evident in the framework that we've got there, and I think that there's, in some cases you might say, well, there's nothing new. It might be confirming some of the other research that's been undertaken.
And one of the values of research is often that it does confirm
it's
things that people are expecting. Just scrolling through some of the questions as they're coming in.
Given the dissatisfaction with work-life balance in Australia, can you provide more details about the aspects that were of particular concern? Well, I think this particular study didn't pick that up. The one I mentioned was from the Australian Workplace Work-Life Index study, but this is particularly, we know from other research, tends to be people in management positions who are taking unpaid or undertaking unpaid overtime. And an earlier study showed that Australia was very high in terms of the unpaid overtime that's being undertaken. So I think this is a case of, again, attention needed to be paid. And this particular study showed that sometimes men were suffering in the workplace because there was recognition that in many cases women have taken on the major caring role, but when men wanted to maybe take on some caring responsibilities, there was not such an openness in the workplace to them being able to do that. Yes, there's a couple of questions here about the Fair Work Australia, and there wasn't really included in the study as an area that we did analyse and to find out whether there were factors that were influencing that related to Fair Work Australia. We have in the report obviously mentioned some of the conditions in the Australian workplace and how that does influence it, but it isn't something that we could comment on in detail. One of the other questions is, do perceptions of job quality differ in the service sector? Certainly if we look at the aged care workplace, yes, we would say that that was different. There was, as I mentioned already, dissatisfaction with pay, but also the aged care workers felt that they were undertaking a very valuable job, but not necessarily being recognised for the value that they were imparting there with their clients. So yes, I think this will be maybe true of other sectors that are similar in that sense.
got here a question about the impact of technology in the workplace. And it's really to focus on saying, given there is obviously a growing impact, I guess this is more just from your perspective, Professor Connell, what effect do you think it might have on quality of work in the future? You may have already picked up something in your research, but in terms of your broader research background, are there any insights into this area?
Well, we found that IT influences nearly all forms of work, and there can be issues around additional training that's required, displacement, and also the nature of work and workplaces itself can be transformed. We know that I mentioned already about call centres and business process offshoring, where a lot of the work has actually gone from the back office into a call centre. So in general, workplaces are looking to keep up with IT developments and address training and upskilling. But there was nothing systematic that was evident in our work, and I think this is potentially an area for policy discussion and to be addressed in the future.
Okay.
I think we've got another question here about what are the core policy lessons for the study for Australia. I guess we weren't actually asked to identify policy, but what I think we could be looking at is necessarily issues with reinforcing those which we found had positive impact and addressing those where the opposite was actually occurring. And paying attention to the 8 Australia-specific factors that we found influence the quality of work. And I mentioned just now that perhaps information technology is an area that we could be considering as a potential area for policy discussion. How is it impacting on work and the workplace?
We're just scrolling through the questions now just to make sure that we're covering them all. I think we've nearly got there. Just checking back on some earlier questions. There's one here about whether you're aware, Professor Connell, of any cases where a job quality framework is used to influence an enterprise agreement.
No, that didn't come up at all. That, as I said, we found that most of the reactions, or most of what was happening in our case study organisations, was reactive rather than proactive. Although one of our strategies, having undertaken the case studies, was to go back to the organisations and share the results with them, and they all said they found it interesting and useful. And I think that it either reinforces or highlighted, we gave them sort of areas for attention in some cases, and we did put in our report, if anyone gets to read the report, the challenges for certain workplaces, and I think they would certainly take those on board for the future.
So there's certainly some lessons that can be drawn out in terms of good practice within enterprises,
definitely,
from the work that you've done. And I think certainly our board valued those sorts of findings and would want to be promoting those. I do recall that we had one question that came in prior to the webinar, which was asking about what would be the sort of key factors and solutions to employees' work contribution, which I think is really getting at the issue of what's important from an employee's perspective in terms of enabling them to make a very positive contribution. You probably covered some of that. You might want to just recap a bit.
Well, I think that is certainly one of the factors that did come out quite strongly in the job prospects. People feeling that's where it came again, the issue about expectations. It's important to have the conversation with the direct supervisor and or whoever relevant about, what are the expectations, what prospects do I have for my job, and this came out across the board. And also recognition. So, people want to feel that their job is contributing and is important in the organisation. Doesn't matter what they're doing, that it's important than just the pay. So that was that spillover effect. And certainly in organisations such as Energy Co, there was such a positive culture that people were saying that, it really did influence others to want to join that organisation and make people stay, even where the pay was lower. And I think they were sort of the evident factors of the intrinsic versus the extrinsic factors in that framework.
Yeah, which is a really interesting finding in itself, isn't it? Well, look, we don't seem to be having any more questions coming in at the moment, so I think at this stage we could probably decide that we might conclude our webinar. We do thank everyone who has participated today and for your interest in this interesting topic, I think, of quality of work. And we do once again, I'd like to thank Professor Connell on behalf of AWPA for her presentation today, and more broadly for the work that she and her team did in this research project. So thank you, everyone, and farewell till next time.
Thank you for letting us take the project. It was very interesting for us.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it too. Thank you.